My utmost appreciation for the organizers for giving me a chance to deliver a very important topic this afternoon. I have a PowerPoint presentation being, I'm a full-time academic, basically teaching undergrads, and of course, the generation now is highly visual, so I have to use visuals, basically. So my presentation would not be specifically about Taiwan, but basically how the Philippines will get involved in a Taiwan scenario, which people in Indo-Pacific would basically say it might be in 2027. So my topic will be looking at how the Philippines in a way is preparing for what I call the inevitable. So I start, of course, with how President Marcos reacted when he was asked about Taiwan, and coming from the northern part of Luzon in Ilocos, he said, we could basically see Taiwan from where it's coming from. And whatever would happen in Taiwan will, of course, affect the Philippines. So, of course, in the third decade of the 21st century, Taiwan stands as what I call the four major flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific region. And basically, along with the South China Sea, along, of course, with the Korean Peninsula and Senkaku Dayahu. But, if you'll ask me, what is basically the most dangerous, it's Taiwan, primarily because of the fact that from President Xi Jinping's view, the 100-year civil war that began, of course, in 1927 had to end. So, of course, the Taiwan issue has to do with what happened in 1949 when, of course, the Kuomintang were pushed out of mainland China by the forces, communist forces led, of course, by Chairman Mao Zedong. So basically, it has created the long, protracted crisis in Taiwan between China and of course, Taiwan, as described as a maintenance of a never-ending, constantly evolving status quo. So people are talking about the status quo, but we know for a fact that the status quo has been dramatically changed. Of course, what are the changes? Number one, of course, is the fact that in 1978, during the Carter administration, you have, of course, a dramatic change regarding American support to China. Of course, prior to that, we talk of the visit of President Nixon in 1972, at the time that the United States and China still did not have a diplomatic relation, Kissingerian approach. But two very important things that we have to take into account. Number one, of course, China has now the second largest economy in the world, and a very important factor that people tend to basically ignore is what's happening in Taiwan. The Taiwanese nation has developed a sense of national identity, especially the ruling party right now, simply reflects the sentiment of many Taiwanese. The Taiwanese are not anymore Chinese. And of course, they are entitled to their own independence. Again, going back to the Wilsonian notion of national self-determination. Maintaining the delicate status quo in the Taiwan state returns to currency, despite, of course, this extremely changing environment. This dynamic and dangerous central milieu, of course, is what the Philippines is facing. Although, of course, at this point in time, the majority of the Filipino people always look at the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. Basically, have been oblivious to the fact that the volcano, being a part of not only the first island chain, being in what's called the Ring of Fire, it's of course the fact that we have a sitting volcano not very far, of course, from Luzon. The Philippines is Taiwan's nearest neighbor, and of course Southeast Asia's countries facing China across the South China Sea. Both countries are located in either end of Luzon Strait, the maritime choke point that reaches out in the northern part of the South China Sea and the waters of the Western Pacific, constituting what, of course, you remember Dean Acheson said in 1949, part of the U.S. defense perimeter, of course, just before the North Korean invasion of South Korea in the 1950s. Of course, I always tell this to my students in the Defense Department every time I talk about Taiwan. Few hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, you have, of course, the destruction of the air power of the United States Armed Forces in the Pacific, led by General MacArthur, and those bombers and fighter planes came from Taiwan. So easy, of course, and the Taiwanese contributed, I think, an entire division that was part of the Japanese invasion forces that, of course, invaded the Philippines after a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. Of course, the first time that the Taiwan Strait became apparent to the Philippines what happened in 1996. During that time, of course, you have the election, first democratic election in Taiwan. Washington deployed 2 carrier battle groups during the time of the Clinton administration shocked the Chinese, President Xi Jinping. China basically said, this will never happen again. Of course, this is the beginning of China's development of what we call anti-access area denial capabilities, which I will be discussing later. So after the incident, Washington, of course, had greater impetus to again repair the alliance with the Philippines after, of course, U.S. forces withdrew from the Philippines after 1991, when the Philippine Senate did not concur to the Philippine-American Cooperation Treaty of 1991. So basically the realization that there's a need to repair the alliance in the form of a visiting force agreement. Eventually, of course, Taiwan craze led to, I would call, the repair of the alliance. After, of course, you have the sense of bitterness, especially coming from Washington, D.C., after, of course, we asked American forces to vacate initially Clark, then eventually, of course, Subic Naval Base. So what basically gave rise again to this notion? Of course, eventually, of course, Taiwan has been forgotten after the visiting force agreement was signed. Eventually, everyone focused on the war on terror and right now the South China Sea. But why did the South, Taiwan issue became apparent again? Of course, it happened when you have, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That happened, of course, in February 2022. Of course, at that time, they create basically the notion, especially in Beijing, if Russia could do it against Ukraine, we could do it against Taiwan. So we could not separate what's happening in Europe with what's happening, of course, in the Indo-Pacific. If Russia will get its way regarding Ukraine, this will basically give Xi Jinping all the incentives he needs to basically duplicate what President Putin will be doing against Ukraine. Hopefully not. Okay? So at that time, of course, former President Rodrigo Duterte offered. Everyone was kind of surprised. We know for a fact in October 2016, he announced in Beijing, I'm separating from the United States, China and Russia here account. Circa 2022 suddenly said, I'm opening Clark and Subic for American forces. Of course, this was a realization within the Duterte administration that again, if Russia could do it against Ukraine, China could do it against Taiwan and possibly, of course, even against the in the South China Sea. So, of course, there's a realization right now that we cannot separate Ukraine, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, with what China might do in the South China Sea. Of course, a realization that there's now a strategic alignment. Again, this is not new. You can still remember the Sino-Soviet alliance just before, of course, the Korean War. So the Duterte administration expressed willingness. Surprisingly, Ambassador Babes Romualdez basically told the Pentagon, we're open. But I think this was ignored in Washington, D.C., primarily because of former President Rodrigo Duterte as, of course, the main appeaser of China during the first 5 years of his term. But of course, I could argue this changed in the latter part of his term. So what's basically when we talk about confronting the inevitable? Of course, Manila is very much aware the conflict between Beijing, Taiwan erupts, the Taiwan Straits, there's no way that the Philippines could avoid it. We're in a way a prisoner of geography. We're also in a way part of certain circumstances that we could not basically ignore. But one thing is clear, and this is a primary concern of both administration, from the Duterte to the Marcos administration, we have 200,000 Filipino OFWs working in Taiwan. There's no way that we could evacuate them under wartime condition. Marcos administration found it easy, of course, to improve Philippine security relations with China, with the United States, after, of course, it suffered a major breakdown during the Duterte administration, basically realizing that whether we appease or challenge China, we get the same result, and that is, of course, subjugation. So, of course, the effort to improve the alliance. Initially, of course, President Marcos asked the United States, although there's no effort on his part to ask the United States to clarify whether we would get support from the United States or not, he created the condition wherein, of course, American forces would play an important role. Growing realization is establishment that armed conflict erupts in Taiwan and the U.S. becomes the Philippines must bear in mind that we will be affected for two very important reasons. Number one, of course, the option of neutrality is simply out of the picture because historically, there's no such thing as an armed neutrality. Just looking at the cases of Switzerland and Sweden during the Second World War. Neutrality is not even a guarantee. The United States was also armed during the Second World War, yet it got involved. But there's no chance that you can effect neutrality if you're not armed. The Armed Forces of the Philippines, of course, has simply no capability, especially in terms of Air Force and the Navy, primarily because of its 75-year focus on internal security. And of course, we're a treaty ally of the United States. We expect the United States to assist us in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. There's no reason, there's no doubt that if the United States will invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty when it comes to Taiwan, we have to support our treaty ally. Not only the Philippines, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and of course even Australia. So drifting to the involvement, what are the cases basically that would of course enable us to respond to a Taiwan Strait incident? Of course, the first measure was adopted by the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Of course, with the encouragement and support by President Bongbong Marcos, we have to repair our alliance after the 6-year effort by the Duterte administration to basically unravel the alliance. Thank God we have then Secretary Delpin Lorenzana and the Armed Forces of the Philippines who saved the alliance from, of course, the appeasement policy of former President Rodrigo Duterte. Both defense secretaries admitted the necessity of improving the alliance. Let me go to the specific, of course, improving the alliance means again, reaffirming the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, and more importantly, of course, we talk of the additional 4 enhanced defense cooperation sites. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed in 2014. The Duterte administration sat on it for a couple of years. Eventually, he decided to implement it after, of course, you have the siege of Marawi and you have massive American support to the Armed Forces of the Philippines during the battle for Marawi. So in return, of course, he started implementing the Enhanced Defense Cooperation site. Then, of course, the site would basically 4 sites that were, of course, announced. I think this was around April. I still remember it was Holy Wednesday. And you have 4 Chinese academics who were in Manila telling us, we have no right to become involved in the U.S.-China strategic competition. I take it from the Chinese. U.S. forces, of course, have strategic vantage point. Interestingly, U.S. forces, of course, had been conducting military exercises here, additional EDCA sites, and of course, the nature of military exercises that have been conducted, interestingly, since 2022, has, of course, had to do with conventional warfighting capabilities. So what would be, of course, the assistance sites? Number one, of course, the most basic would be training. Acclimate American forces who might be coming from Guam and Hawaii in a tropical situation. Forward facilities for the United States Navy and Marine, especially in terms of repairing. The same way as Japan played in repairing American naval assets during the Korean War. That's why, of course, we still have Subic, importance of Subic. Fortunately, of course, Subic, when Hanjin went bankrupt, a Chinese company was initially thinking of buying it. Thank God for, of course, Cerebus. You know, now, of course, the CEO of Cerebus is the second in the Pentagon. Of course, providing launching pads for counter-operation, of course, from the U.S. Air Force. Providing facilities for U.S. nuclear attack submarines. And of course, long-range anti-ship missiles. China is really dead set against the Philippines because of our decision to allow U.S. Army medium-range capable launchers to be based here at Typhoon. Chinese have been raising hell all over the place, telling us that we could not allow those launchers in Philippine territory. You know, when you talk about national security matters, this is deemed as sacrosanct. No country could ever tell you how you would enhance your national security, how you would assure your survival. But for the Chinese, you know, the Middle Kingdom mentality simply could not be avoided. And of course, I don't know if you remember when you have the debate between Admiral Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur whether the Philippines should be bypassed or the Navy go to Taiwan. General MacArthur said the Philippines could be a very important base for blockade operation against Japan. I think this will matter a lot. Primarily, of course, many analysts would say, hopefully it will not happen. If push comes to shove, this will be a protracted conflict where, of course, blockade applied, of course, by the Union forces against the Confederate, applied by the British and Allied forces against Germany during the First World War, would really matter. So again, the Philippines would very play a part. Now, this is basically how the Philippines, as a sovereign, independent country with a military capability, could play a role. Okay, let's proceed. So, what is the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept? Of course, it is in a way, I would use the term a grand strategy. The first time that the Philippine government has announced a grand strategy that, of course, aims to project our capability not to protect the islands, but to protect our archipelagic waters. Just a little sort of a background regarding CADC. Before CADC came out, the defense notion of the Philippines is still based on the 1920 War Plan Orange that was drafted by the United States Navy in the 1920s against Japan. A lot of things have changed since the 1920s. So CADC, of course, we will not defend the islands, we will have to defend the entire archipelago. And this will, of course, means enabling the military to develop capabilities, naval and air capabilities. I'll just have to breeze through this. Primary reason, of course, of President Marcos' decision is to formulate the CADC's China's maritime expansion. Secretary of National Defense, Secretary Gibo Chitoro, already uses the term. I think it's the language used in the defense establishment. It's not a territorial dispute, it's maritime expansion, the same way as Japan expanded during the Pacific War. So this stem, of course, from the recognition that China's maritime expansion is the clear and present danger to Philippine national security. It's not anymore the New People's Army or the Abu Sayyaf. No, it's Chinese maritime expansion. And ordinary Filipinos are aware of this fact, given the fact that you have Chinese Coast Guard vessel just conducting intrusive patrols deep inside Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. I'll just breeze through this. CADC, it's not you. It's basically systematized what has already been there. So just give key elements. Long-term goal, of course, is the military to be able to project its capabilities way into our exclusive economic zone, into islands that we can control. CADC is premised on the assumption that there's limits to what we can have. Given our archipelagic territory, we have to develop and explore what we call a blue economy. CADC defines the country's military attention resources away from the islands. So the key point, develop and project the Armed Forces Philippines limited capabilities to the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And this is something very important. We have to develop strategic depth. We cannot simply wait for the opponent to land on our coast. We have to basically interdict them, prevent them from landing to the Philippine coast. Develop, of course, the marine domain awareness. I'll just breeze through this. What are the key points regarding CADC? Developing of adequate radar coverage to detect, identify, air, enable intrusion in Philippine territory, including our exclusive economic zone. Thank God for Japan. Japan has been providing us quality, heavy radar, acquisition of air and maritime assets with adequate defensive and offensive capabilities. The BrahMos missile that was, of course, mentioned by Professor Admiral Ong is there. The presence of the Typhoon missiles there is a plan, of course, to acquire more missile system to compensate for the fact that it will take some time for the Navy and the Air Force to develop their capabilities. Acquisition of missile system to counter missile capabilities, complement air. We already have the BrahMos here, courtesy of India. We're thinking of acquiring systems similar, of course, to the Typhoon. But as long as the Typhoon is, it will take some time before, of course, we could have the resource by the Typhoon. The U.S. Army Typhoon would, of course, play that role. They develop the AP's command central capabilities to enhance joint operation. So CADC also accepts the fact that alliances and security partnerships are important. We're facing a country that has the second largest economy in the world, has the largest Navy in the world, has the largest Coast Guard in the world, is hell-bent on expanding into the waters of the first island chain. There's no way that we could do it alone. We have to rely, of course, on our treaty partner, the United States, and other security partners like Japan, Australia, Canada, like-minded countries. So the moves are directed at strengthening the Philippines' diplomatic and strategic posture against China. So China simply won't take us for granted and consider us a meat on the table. But by developing CADC, we're also incidentally preparing to address another potential challenge, and that is, of course, Taiwan. Although the focus of the CADC is the West Philippines Sea, South China Sea, how would CADC enable us to play a role in a Taiwan Strait scenario? Development of AFP anti-access area denial capabilities can enable it to project forces that will, of course, play a very important role, choke points, just in case China would effect an invasion of Taiwan. That's, of course, Luzon Strait. We don't want the Chinese to basically control the Luzon Strait and take control of the Batanes Island. The Balintang and Bashi channels, all located, of course, in northern Luzon, and will, of course, strategically important for the PLA if China uses force against Taiwan, effect an armed invasion. And more importantly, is enable us to assist and conduct joint military operation with the United States if, of course, in a case of the Taiwan scenario, what we call the Mutual Defense Force Compact Plan, which is renewed every year, would have to be invoked by any of the other party. Okay, just a conclusion. Let's breeze through this. Because of course, the Philippines right now adopts a highly legalistic and stringent one China policy. Every time Taiwan is mentioned, you'll have somebody in the Philippine department who would remind us, we have a one China policy. You know, if we sneeze in the direction of Taiwan, somebody will tell us, you have a strict one China policy. So the Marcos administration is implementing policies that can enable the treaty ally, the U.S., and its armed forces to respond to any Chinese armed invasion of course, our nearest neighbor, which is Taiwan. No amount of a very strict, legalistic one China policy will alter geography. What will happen to Taiwan will affect us whether we like it or not. So the current administration has increased the number, of course, of EDCA sites. October, of course, decided to basically ensure that American forces would be there available just in case you have a major conflict in the first island chain. Adoption of the CADC, so forth and so on. Just a breeze through what are, of course, the challenges regarding CADC. CADC will be a very expensive undertaking. We need, of course, the support of allies like the United States. So what is the Philippines is looking at now is the freeze in the assistance. The Biden administration promised the Philippine government $500 million. And we're looking at whether the Trump administration would hopefully continue and possibly increase that military assistance so we can play our role as a reliable treaty ally of the United States if push comes to shove in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your...
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.